All right, it's card breakdown time. We've had about 2 days to play with Flame of Xulta cards, probably been playing about 12 hours total, and having a really delightful time with the set, enjoying ourselves tremendously. We're going to do the card breakdowns a little bit differently this time. I think what I'm going to do first is I'm going to break down all of the legendaries in the set, just to sort of give you an idea of what's very important to craft and what's like less useful and more reasonable to skip. Certainly there's a lot of interesting options, and there's plenty of different things that you can build around. Basically, I think every single one of the like big hybrid legendaries will lead you down a path that is something that you can definitely play around with, and the same is true of the tricolor sites. They support really specific strategies, but they're also really, really fun to play with, so there's a lot of different things that you can go for. Certainly just pick whatever is most fun for you is my main advice for crafting legendaries. But I wanted to review these first to shorten the list a little bit when we get into faction-specific breakdowns, and also to talk about all of the shiny things that are going to be, on your craft list or on your do not craft list for a while in the future. Let's get into it, and we'll talk about each one of these in order. So starting with Akko Inspired Artist, I would say this card is pretty strong, very strong craft in Oni decks, and one of the better Oni cards that has been printed so far. It's a 1/1 for 1 that immediately becomes a 2/3 for 1 if it gets to attack on the turn that it's played, meaning that if this was played first turn, it's probably going to be a 2/3 for 1, no problems, just easy, easy, easy. If you get the mastery on it, that is not as useful as it seems, just because there's generally a lot of like value-based propositions there where you're trying to get a lot of things going on at the same time. But if you're running relic weapons, it's really, really good. If you're running Oni, it's simply okay, and it's actually pretty decent overall. Certainly doesn't stop you from getting wrecked by hard removal or anything like that, but it's still an amazing bonus for a 1-cost unit, and also something you can potentially abuse in many, many different ways. I've been rolled by a couple of Oni decks running this already. Bare Arms on it was very silly and fun expedition stuff. I think this card's very strong in expeditions. It's also quite strong in ranked. Both are really reasonable options, so if you're planning on playing in throne mode or if you're planning on playing in expeditions, this card's perfectly reasonable to craft. It really just depends on whether or not you like Onis or not, and also whether or not you like big ol' weapons and like the general Warcry style. But I would say overall this is a pretty high craft. Cozen Darkheart, 1/5, when you play a dragon with a name you don't already have, create and draw a treasure trove. Mastery 3, play a 4/4 Cinder Dragon with flying. That double red, again, a little bit difficult to play, but does have that nice health stat. I think RNG listed this as like one of their top 10 cards, and I am skeptical. We played with it a little bit and had some fun with it with dragons, and it was just like, it was a little awkward most of the time. It was very hard to play it and actually get all of the value that you wanted, because A, it's not really giving you any tempo pressure, B, the treasure troves mean that you're losing even more pressure there, and like C, it's an Oni with a 1/5 health bar. Like, it's just like, it's a little bit difficult to get everything working. Nonetheless, the card does have some play and control, and if you're playing the right type of Oni and Dragons deck, I think there's definitely a good spot for it, because that stat line is really, really nice for a sticky unit that also allows you to play some other good benefits. And if you can get the free Cinder Dragon off of it, which is really not that hard, I think this card's really reasonable. Like, overall, like, basically you want to play it in a deck that's not super heavy on the control, and Miller goes for the Cinder Dragon with the flying, but I would say that, yeah, it's a pretty solid stat line and a pretty solid unit. Certainly nothing wrong with it, and does do a lot of interesting things. But yeah, like, certainly is tricky, doesn't have a lot of onboard abilities, so a little bit difficult to play. Not sure about this one yet. Galai Shavka's Listener. This looks like the worst of the summon invoke cards. It does replace itself immediately, but it's also deepen fire for a card that doesn't have any health and doesn't have a lot of board influence. You get that invoke, and then you get like probably a fire card that might not help you actually get past that Sandstorm Titan or whatever other big thing you're going with. It's still pretty aggressive, but of the listeners, I think it's the weakest of the 5 and the one that you should probably craft last. If there's a particular red deck that you really want to run that needs a lot of card draw, this is something that can definitely get you into some interesting places, because that extra value off of the invoke can really help you in a tight spot. These guys are essentially like merchants at 4. They get you a lot of interesting value and potentially pick you up some sort of solution that you need for problems that you have to solve. So super fun, but also like this one's just like not quite there on stats. Alright, Spear of the Dying Sun. 10-4, the enemy player can't gain health. Spellcraft 5, play Decimation. This card's way stronger than it looks. I really like it in ranked with Lava Blood, or not Lava Blood, Goliath. I've made this mistake before. Great Kiln Titan. The 8 cost 9-7. You can do some pretty wild things with it. Basically, getting that card is just really, really nice. It does a lot of damage, and if you play it at the full 14, then you get to kill 2 large things and potentially deal as much as 20 damage to your opponent's face, making it one of the most powerful top decks that you can get. That being said, this only exists as a top deck. You have to ramp to it. You have to do something cheaty to get it out. So if you don't have a very specific plan, definitely not worth playing in that respect. Plays really well with Kairos and curves pretty well with that type of card. So if you're playing a deck that's already ramping to Kairos, Spear of the Dying Sun is not an unreasonable thing to play. On the other hand, Kairos being out usually means that you're playing big units anyways, so you're probably not too worried about Spear of the Dying Sun in that case, which means that there's more difficult things to do with Spear of the Dying Sun. Regardless, this card was an instant include in our Invoke deck, Invocation Impossible, and we really enjoyed it there. It's a lot of fun. It's not amazingly good, but it's still at least mediocre and at least in like the range to do some cool things in Control. Nash Unrelenting. 4-4 for 3, muster, gets +3/+3. Your other units are invulnerable to damage this turn. Learning from the previous Nash, this card actually costs a full 3 for a 6/6 instead of 4 for a 7/7 sometimes. And yeah, like I think the 4/4 base on the 3-cost card means that it's a lot more powerful in general. This is a pretty strong muster card. It's very aggro muster, which is a little harder to do than control muster with Sodi, but also Sodi supports that kind of strat pretty well, so there's plenty of things to do with it. The invulnerability to damage is situational and not that great, but in general, this is a reasonable use of muster. I would put this card at relatively average, not a super high value craft, but certainly if you're playing like Mono Time or something like that, that's something to go for. Woda Grodov's Listener. This looks like, to me, the strongest of the 5 listeners. The Shadow one is also quite strong, but this one is the one that actually gets to be active on the first turn in Combre lists that it is played, or like on the turn after it is played, rather. So on its attack, you typically just give it a +3/+3, and you're good to go. You can also pay 8 for it and get that +3/+3 for cheap, so not too bad on that front. Time cards are usually really high value, so this is a card that adds a lot of value to your deck, even though it's got a relatively low stat line, and it just benefits really well from Finest Hours and other things. Seems to trade super well. It's a great expedition card. We played a lot with this in the deck that we are putting up on Tuesday, so look for that. It's called I actually forgot what I named it. Master of Disaster. It's delightful. Yeah, this card's really fun. Anthem of Grodov. I would say that in general, making things in your hand have bonuses is not usually amazing in ranked or expeditions. This does make everything in your hand bigger, but it also loses you out on card advantage. This is one of the lower crafts for legendaries. There are some cool things that you can do with it, no doubt, but also like it's something that you gotta kind of work around. Soul's Rest. Take an additional turn, put each unit into its owner's hand. If this card is good, it's bad, and it should be nerfed. So I would say, like, don't craft this highly, because even if it does end up being in some kind of broken deck, then that's probably something that you're going to be seeing. Well, at least you'll get your dust back when they inevitably nerf it. I would say at the moment, the Decimate combined with an extra turn means that you don't get a lot of value out of it. There's still a lot of cool things to do with it. So this is the kind of thing that you craft if you want to play basically Drago control from Magic and do like your interesting take an extra turn stuff. You get to dirtle around a lot more. You get to play longer games. You get to play like wild amounts of fun stuff. It's pretty exciting, but overall this isn't really doing anything for you if you are trying to get some good stuff going. So pretty low in power, but definitely high in fun if you're trying to play for some interesting combos and do some interesting things with it. The Decimate is certainly powerful, but also like even after taking an additional turn, you reestablish your board, then your opponent reestablishes their board. They're in a blocking position. That's kind of okay, but it's mostly just a reset. And a lot of the resets don't really work the way that you want them to. I would say overall, you've definitely got value for it, but yeah, it's not going to be amazing. Shenra, Unbreakable. I'd put this card at very strong to, yeah, like, it is definitely, like, in the upper regions of craftables. 1 cost 2/1 with invulnerable to damage. Can't have weapons or curses played on it. That includes your weapons, but it also includes enemy curses, which is pretty important because there's a decent amount of curse removal and stuff going on. Can't permafrost this, can't get rid of it with Affliction, can't get rid of it with a lot of the unseen stuff. So, yeah, reasonable on that front. You play this card on 1, it's going to do massive amounts of damage for you and get a ton of value value. You play it on like 5 or 6, it's a little bit rougher, but overall, she seems like she just kind of crushes. I've really had a lot of success with her in both the curse-based deck and the mastery deck that we played in, and she seems quite strong. So really happy with this card overall. It's definitely a workhorse, and it'll fit in a lot of different decks because it's a simple 1-drop that you can play that is also really aggressive and difficult to deal with. So love this card. I would say, yeah, pretty high craft. Not going to be a defining legendary, but is going to be a legendary that you'll fit in a lot more decks than a lot of your defining legendaries. So very high on that list. Lay Siege. Ready your units. They get endurance and invulnerable to damage this turn. This is probably a lower craft for you because it's something that you kind of have a really specific deck to get value out of, but it's really good in mastery lists. Overall, it does still require you to do a lot of other things to actually get your best value, but it's an amazing sweeper trick, really fun to pick out of the market. I'd say craft one of them, stick it in a market in a big mastery deck of that kind, but probably don't go too heavy on it until you're really comfy with whether or not it's going to go after. So yeah, not a high value craft, but certainly a really exciting card that does do a lot of cool things. We have Izuzi Kodash's Listener. Double damage, summon, invoke, and mastery 10 +3/+3 and invoke. Vara's Favor is still in the format. This is probably this is tied with the 4/1 that has charge for worst of them. The mastery is nice, and if you can actually get the sort of shenanigans out of it, it's really pretty reasonable, but overall Izuzi is going to be really hard to keep on board. At least replaces itself and does have a lot of ways to just win the game in a really big pinch. So yeah, I'm happy with this card as it stands, but it is probably in the bottom tier of the listeners, and while all of the listeners are pretty good, this one requires a lot out of you that you might not want to go with. Age-Worn Vestige, 3/9, Spellcraft 3, play Harsh Rule. That Spellcraft is not worth it. Like, if you're up at 9, you probably don't want to sweep the entire board just to have a 3/9 relic. It's not super great on that front, but you can certainly do some good things with the general stat line of this card. This is a low to medium craft. It's not anything amazing for your deck, but you can certainly play it if you got some other stuff going on. Socrato Fury Heart. 1 cost 4/5. At the end of your turn, Socrato deals 7 damage to himself. I don't know what deck this belongs in yet. There may not be a deck that he belongs in yet. He's kind of a muster card, but it's a little hard to play the musters with Socrato, so overall I'm not certain that there's a real Socrato deck. Basically, I would say, unless you're intent on building that deck, don't craft this card, and probably even dust it if you aren't looking for it. It's a real big stat line on a 1-drop, but you gotta find a real place for it, and this is not something that we necessarily have at the moment. Blitrock, Linray's Listener, pops Aegises, deals damage to small units. Really, really fun in expeditions in general, and that's sort of like where the competitive scene is going to be focused for the next month and a half. So seems like something that's certainly worth looking at, and overall I do like this card in many different ways. The Primal cards that you get off of it tend to be really good answers. Primal is very good at supporting things, so when you're playing a card like this, you have all the little like sweepers going on, but you also tend to pick up a card that is going to solve a particular problem that you're having on board. I like Blitrock quite a bit. I think this is in upper echelons, like along with the time card. So strongish Listener, certainly worth crafting, but like, yeah, it's definitely not, I would say, your go-to first card for crafting, unless you're really fond of Invoke, which you should be. It's a great mechanic. It's really, really fun to play. So these guys are always workhorses and will play well in most decks, and that's the thing about Listeners versus the big hybrid cards, is that if you don't know what deck you want to build, these guys are pretty good to pick up because they are basically just like, if you're supporting a color, throw them in. If you do know which deck you want to build, you're going to want to go for the big hybrid cards that do specific things for those decks, and we'll talk about those as we get into them. Burspore Fern, Aegis Overwhelm, Mastery 10. For the rest of the game, when you play a spell, play an additional copy of it. I have a hard time, I don't know, there's an Aegis and Overwhelm on this card. The Aegis in particular makes it really interesting for Mastery, but it is also a hard Mastery to hit, and then like, it's hard to say exactly how strong this card's going to be overall. I think it's pretty good, but it's definitely an average craft for me. It's not anything that I would say is going to go super high on my list unless I'm building a deck specifically around this idea. As a 6-drop, it's kind of cool, but like there's a rare that's very good with Mastery as well, and playing that first is usually going to be the thing that you're going to be working with. Nonetheless, this is one of the most fun legendaries in the set. I'm very excited about this card, and I can't wait to craft a bunch of them, but I wouldn't recommend it super highly. Flight of Makar, transform each unit into a 1/1 Raven with flying. Nuts with Vargo's Pelt. If you're not building like a Mind Link Vargo's Pelt deck with this, I don't know what you use it for. It is cute, but I would say that overall it's probably not something you want to go crazy with. It's not a great harsh roll. Getting a bunch of Ravens with flying is really, really cool, and I think there's a lot of cool things going on with it, but this is a weird Primal Harsh roll in comparison to the very good Combre Harsh roll. Probably don't craft this one super highly. Incarnus, Makar's Listener, unblockable, so it basically does do a ton of damage very, very early on. Takes a while to establish mastery, but seems like a pretty strong card and a lot of fun to play. Listeners get you a lot of removal in general because your spells are just going to have tons of removal and your shadow cards are going to have deadly. So and also you have access to a bunch of new curses. Like, yeah, Incarnus is really, really good at solving many, many problems. It's also unblockable and the mastery on it is great. I think this is probably, yeah, like with time, it's tied for strongest. But yeah, I think it's really, really good overall. Seems great. Carvet Solar Dragon, flying lifesteal your cultists have exalted. I think this card really supports dragons. If you like dragons a lot, this is something that is just kind of amazing. It's dragons and cultists together, so you got to get a lot of things going on to actually make this work. If you like the cultist play and you like the dragon play and you like them playing together, then like, yeah, that Xenon deck that you get as a starter, you can definitely try Nahid's Faithful and see if that's going to be interesting, and if it is, go ahead and go with Carvet Solar Dragon. This card is pretty reasonable. It's the Black Sky Harbinger of the set for Shadow because it gets you a little bit of lifesteal, a little bit of flying, and a little bit of defense with the cultists that you're getting. The Exalted ability is not that great, but overall this card's a reasonable stat line on a 6-drop. I like it a lot. Average to high for me. Not necessarily amazing, but certainly was a good pick for the dragon deck that we were running. And you can definitely get just one of them to get like all of those unique dragons. Certainly fun. Aramot Death Incarnate, unblockable. When an enemy hits you, kill it. When Aramot attacks, the enemy player discards the top 10 cards of their deck. I don't know what you have to do to a mill card to make me like it. This one's definitely the strongest mill card we've seen so far. It's got an amazing amount of different abilities, and if you can actually get some good like counter spells on it, then being just unhittable is kind of good. But also, you still need lifesteal so that you can stay alive when your opponent is hitting you with multiple units. The mill is not going to kill them that quickly. The damage isn't going to kill them that quickly, and it's a 7 cost for a unit that doesn't have any onboard impact. Low craft for the most part. Mill in general, not something you want to go for. Not really sure where I am on Vicious Rejuvenation yet. At the moment, I'm thinking it's bottom of the rankings for crafting, but certainly if you want to play around with it a little bit, it is a fun card to get into like a big ramp deck and then just kind of play around with tokens, try to modify your health total in such a way that your opponent isn't really aware of it, swap it in from the market, or just pull it out and then torch them in the face. That's a cute plan. It's only going to work for so long. You can't put it in a tier 1 deck and expect people to not like play around it, but still kind of cool. Craft one of these if you're feeling like it, but by and large, ignore it. Kairos Grand Champion, you should get some of these for free for the pre-order, but also like is a great Praxis card. Absolutely ridiculous. Obviously plays well in any sort of Praxis ramp, and as I said, there is a hybrid legendary for I think every color at the moment. All of them are very good, but they're all for very specific types of decks. So Praxis, big stuff, Kairos Grand Champion. Absolutely amazing. I think it's one of the stronger cards in the set just because even though it is a 9-cost card, it has an immense amount of utility. It gives you all of your cards back on draw. It forces your opponent to spend very hard removal. It gets you a tremendous board advantage. If it is on board, you are going to win the next turn, so your opponent has to do something about it, and that's hard to do at 9. Like basically, this card comes out at the right time, finishes the game in spectacular style. It's fun as hell. I love this card. This is maybe my number 1 for the set. It's really, really strong. Definitely craft it if you want to play with ridiculous Praxis nonsense because it's absolutely delightful. Obviously, that cost is very prohibitive, so you do have to get some ramp going. This may not be the lasting legendary of the set, but it's certainly powerful right now and could be quite a great thing until like Elf Aggro in Xenon picks up or any of the more aggressive strategies pick up in Expeditions. Ryujin Conflict Within. Exalted while you have other Oni, summon kill an enemy with fewer battle skills than your Oni have. I am tepid on this card. It's pretty good with the removal attached to it, but overall for a 6-drop, you could be doing a little bit more with it. I would say that the influence cost on it is a little bit prohibitive. It definitely requires you to have a lot of Oni to get the best value out of it, and even then you're only getting a 1-for-1, which, while not bad, is certainly not the kind of thing that you're seeing off of cards like Heart of the Vault and other things like that. It's not necessarily the definitive Rakano 6. It's still good. It's still very good. So I would say high to moderate, but overall, you have to craft it if you want Oni. And Oni, I still don't think that they're going to be the defining feature of the set, not unless they're paired with dragons or some other form of control. So Ryujin might end up being pretty good, but this is, yeah, middle of the road for me. Gemini the Double Helix. 7/10, Mastery counts all damage, Mastery 100, deal 100 damage to the enemy player. Really need a specific build for this. It's one of the lower crafts out of the 10 that have like the hybrid setup, just because like you got to do a lot of different things for it. It's super fun. So yeah, if you want to play around with it, it's definitely a fun way to kill your opponent. And Skycrag control, while never traditionally that powerful, could be very good with this card. Get the right build around it. It's super fun, but beyond that, like it's really, really specific. This is not going to go in a lot of different decks, even though it has like all of that fun mastery going on. You kind of need a plan if you want the mastery to activate, and if you don't activate the mastery, you're paying for stats, but board advantage not really doing you a lot of favors. Boprex Hope's End. This one's really good in Dragons. I think it's a decent one of, and you just want to pick it up out of like one of your like treasure trove dragon forges or whatever else you've got going on. I don't think you need to craft a lot of these to really go nuts with it, but if you have the right kind of ramp for it, that's fine. Decently high craft, but only need like one. Not a huge deal. Dragons are a lot of fun, and play this with the new Dragon site in particular because it's delightful. The fact that it does give you all of those units back is not that much of a disadvantage. This card is still an 8/8 flying overwhelm with at least a Cloud of Ash attached to it, where you basically just get to knock out a bunch of your opponent's units while you're playing dragons and making very scary things happen. If they don't have removal, it literally ends the game. Like it is just definitively going to end the game in dragons, and I've seen it happen multiple times when played. It's just very, very strong in that respect. Overall, pretty expensive, does require like certain types of dragons to go along. So, you know, like get one, but I wouldn't say go nuts on this card. Amri Dragonbane, go nuts on this card. Another one of the vying cards for strongest in the set. Does require you to go pretty deep on mastery. We had some fun things with this. The fact that enemy dragons can't be played is a pretty huge bonus. I'm kind of surprised that it has that tech, considering how fun dragons are, but there's a lot of things going on with dragons where it seems like they were maybe overpowered or something. Like we don't even have the Oni that reduces their cost in the current set, so we'll see exactly what ends up happening. Regardless, enemy dragons can't be played. If any of your units have completed all of their mastery abilities, they get these effects 2 additional times and refresh their mastery. It's wild with listeners. It's really, really good with listeners in general. So you can do a lot of things with this card, a lot of different types of mastery setups. You don't have to go for a high mastery deck because listeners are so important, and just big Combre stuff with a couple of listeners and a couple of Ambres is still pretty reasonable. I'd say this is a decently high craft, especially if you want to play with listeners. Certainly, you could get the listeners first. Like if you don't have the right mastery cards, this may not be the thing to go for. But it is, you know, one of those specific type of hybrid cards, but it's very, very powerful, and it's one of the more powerful of the 10. Sodi, another one of the more powerful of the 10. This one's really, really high for me. 3/3 with it, start of the turn, draw your card, just gives you amazing value in ranked because you just get, I mean, there isn't a card that draws cards at this cheap at all, and the influence is something that you can easily do in a throne mode. If you're playing expeditions, this is a little harder to get out, but the muster abilities are really, really strong. It's a solid choice there, and also you're getting some for free, or well, sort of for free, off of the precon decks, so they're easier to get your hands on a full set of 4. Yeah, reasonably high craft for me. I would say get it very, very early if you can, because like most of the muster cards are pretty cheap, and this is a fun card to build decks around. I've seen a lot of people playing with the precon Sodi deck, and that deck does have a lot of good late game potential. There's a couple tweaks that need to be made to it, and we might actually talk about what tweaks need to happen for that to be a little bit more ranked viable, since I've seen so many people playing it. But yeah, this is a really, really high craft for me, up in like the 5s, or up in the top 5, I'd say. Nahid the Immortal, another really strong one. Cultists are a little bit harder to use, but this is a nice one to just pull out of your deck at any time. You can probably get away with like maybe 2 of these. You don't need a lot of them because you just need enough to actually have in your deck to play them out of your deck with a 50 health or more deck. Reasonably strong slam on its own, but not actually doing you a huge amount of favors. Like, it is mostly good for that free spell play. So if you aren't playing Cultist with a lot of life gain, Nahid the Immortal is a little bit less useful. But if you can actually get that 50 health, and you know that you can, and you want to get that Nahid going, this is a delightful smashing time. I'm not sure if there's going to be a ranked competitive deck with it, but I think that it is one of the more value-oriented and one of the less inflexible of the options. So probably like 4th or 5th in terms of the 10, but still pretty strong in the list. Perul, Sealkeeper, Endurance Griffins deal double damage, play a Griffin with flying. 5/5 for 6. I'm not sold on this card yet. A single Griffin is not an amazing thing to get, especially if you're trying to go deep into curses, which can get you into a lot of trouble because there's decent curse removal in the set. Combray has a great little 1/3 that does some really good damage. There's a bunch of attachment destruction. There's a Justice card that just breaks all curses and gives Aegis, and that's going to be a market staple. I think Perul's probably in the lower end as far as things crafted. I definitely have 4 of them already because we are playing with curse decks, and if you want to play curses, this is a cool card to be putting in there, but there's also a lot of other options, and you could certainly go for any of those before going for Perul Sealkeeper if you want to. It's still cool, but not like anything that's going to be super amazing. Elah's Martial Scholar, Endurance Unblockable, set each other unit to 3, Mastery 9, play a card of your choice. This one's a little bit slow, and that puts it somewhat low, but it's also pretty reliable, and that puts it a little bit higher. I'd say this is middle of the road, but certainly not bad. If you like the ability and you like sort of playing paladins in general, this is something interesting. If you want to play even paladins, this is a decent craft, obviously, but like, I don't know that even paladins is going to be made all that much better by Elah's. Even paladins already has a lot of different toys, so this is something that's pretty interesting and does a lot of cool things, and the card of your choice from the enemy player's deck is a devastating mastery that you can do some pretty wild stuff with. Similar to the other hybrids, you have to have a plan, but if you got the plan, go for it. Felrauk, the Outcast. Yeah, this looks like one of the stronger options. Obviously, discard is a little bit easier, so you can do some interesting things with Felrauk pretty quickly. You do have to get that influence together to actually get him for free, but the summon ability is very, very strong. Top 5 for me in the legendaries. Definitely, like, if you like Feln and you like discard and like doing some cool stuff with this whole setup, this seems like a really decent option. Overall, good value, good stats. Not that great stats, but the stats combined with the summon ability get you just a really interesting pile of cool stuff going. The one thing that might be difficult about Felrauk is that if we actually get some stuff that really cares about voids, a lot of decks are kind of caring about discard right now and have some like play on discard abilities. If that happens, then this card could get a little bit weaker. It's also still easy to remove for a 6-drop, but still seems like a very reasonable choice for one of the higher picks in the set. Okay, that leads us into the sites. Of these sites, I actually haven't rated these sites against each other yet. We're going to have to take a look and figure out which one we like the best. I'm pretty strong on Xulta Arcanum. 5 health is a lot on a site, and it's pretty hard to actually deal with this thing. In the games that I've seen it, it's actually been very, very difficult to deal with. Xulta Convoy is very, very strong. Vital Arcana is draw 2 on a 7. A site that draws 2 is just getting you so much value because it's saving you an entire round of attacks, getting you a bunch of new cards. Like, even if you don't do anything else, you probably get some benefit out of that. Xulta Convoy gets you good blockers and also gets you really good reasons to actually play other stuff. Playing power to your deck gives you really, really solid late game. This card requires you to get to the late game, though, so I don't think it's going to be the most amazing. We'll have to measure it up against the other ones, but I think it's pretty interesting and does do some wild stuff with ramp. Certainly a stronger card in like the Praxis setups, but I don't know if it's going to be amazing. Profane Nexus. This one seems like the one that's most likely to go off into a mad combo. When you sacrifice a unit, deal 1 damage to the enemy player, Soul's Fury, Last Rites, and Devour. So damage, draw again, and Last Rites. This is probably the cheapest card draw that you can get on 4, and it also comes with a full 3 health and a damage to the enemy player, which might do some other interesting things. Obrak the Feaster is not a great top end, but like overall it seems like something that's pretty worth going for in a tokens deck. This one is very defining for tokens and certainly plays really well in it. I'd say this is a little higher than most of them, but it is nonetheless going to be a little bit more specific. Still, all of the cards off of it are good. The power that it gets you is good. If you're playing lots of tokens and cultists, this seems like a really reasonable option. Bastion of the Dawn. I'm guessing that this is going to be one of the weakest sites, but also Cambrai is pretty interesting right now, and this actually helps mastery strategies better than it helps crown. This is the kind of site that you really craft if you want to play like fun crown decks and really goofy jank. It's great. It's very, very fun, and certainly if you want to do that, I have nothing against it. I don't know if it's going to be that competitive. Safe Return's not amazing. Vision of Austerity and Twinning Ritual. This is one of the only sites that doesn't defend itself, even though it has 5 health and is very, very chunky. So it's interesting, but you have to have a board to actually get it played. I don't know if it's going to be amazing in any major setup. Still seems like 5 health for a 5 cost site could be pretty devastating. This one might be a sleeper, but I'm guessing it's the bottom of the pack. Bastion is okay, so that leaves Outcast Fortress. Just by virtue of being a 3-cost site, I think this one's really, really strong. Pilfer, Protect, and Cruelty are all pretty reasonable. Cruelty, in particular, gets rid of a unit and also sets up curses for you. And curses, while not an amazingly strong option, do seem a lot better when you've got Outcast Fortress out. This definitely seems like a reasonable option. Zelia the Vain is a cool card to play off of it. I think this one is probably second or third best, and certainly might be vying for first. It's really, really solid on that front. All of the cards off of it are decent. It gets you card draw. It gets you... Cruelty is not like as amazing as I thought it was. I was actually thinking that was Torture, but it's still a little bit of damage and a little bit of removal. Something cheap that messes with aggro and forces them to attack into you at 3. Certainly not a bad idea. And somehow I missed Den of Ordeals. Start of your turn, create and draw a treasure trove for each different name among your dragons. Talon Dive, Streets of Flame, and End is Near. Streets of Flame on this card makes it a little bit stronger than some of the other options. End is Near is really unusual and not always the thing you want to play in dragons. And Talon Dive is just like a really, really bad thing to be playing on dragons. I like it a lot. Like, I love this card, and I think that like all of the different dragons that you can play make this card really interesting. But actually, I might rank this one in 4th, right above Bastion. So yeah, looking at them all in order, I would say Profane Nexus and Outcast Fortress vie for first or second. Xulta Arcanum's probably a solid 3rd, and then Den of Ordeals is maybe 4th, and Bastion of the Dawn is 5th. That seems about right to me. Xulta Arcanum could be making that 2nd place slot. I might put it over Profane Nexus in the right type of setup. But yeah, like something like Outcast, Xulta, Nexus, Ordeals, and then Bastion of the Dawn. Ordeals might be... Yeah, that looks about right. Last card is Vera, Hero in Training. This card's cool with mastery setups in 6, so if you want to do some wild things with that, that's certainly something you can play around with. Like basically if you are playing with the Cambrai setup of masteries where you're trying to repeat masteries over and over again, that looks pretty interesting. It's an interesting fit in expeditions in general. Could be a reasonable craft just because it kind of fits in every deck, but also it's hard to get that mastery. You really need some sort of support for it. I would say this is a moderate craft. It's something worth picking up if you really like Strangers and you really like colorless cards, but by and large isn't going to be amazing for you. So leading back into all of that, basically the highest crafts that I would say, like the ones that are really, really interesting to go after. Felrock the Outcast is a strong indicator for Feln in general. Profane Nexus looks like a really interesting option for Cultists and seems like a really solid choice. We need to go back to Legendaries, because somehow we lost that. Kairos Grand Champion is amazing in Praxis. So do the Metamorph is really, really good in Elysian. Both of those really push their particular factions and give you a lot of value. Beyond that, we can definitely go for something along the lines of, I really think the Listeners are all pretty worth it, but the Time Listener and the Shadow Listener are very, very solid. And yeah, those are probably the ones that I would pick as like the top 5. After that, I'd look at Shenra Unbreakable and Akko Inspired Artists to just add a lot of value to your early aggression and get you there into some of the better stuff. So those are my highest crafts for the setup. And then after that, fill out your listeners, fill out your hybrid cards, and play around with different deck styles. And play whatever's fun, of course. Like, in general, my crafting rule is, if it looks fun, craft it, make the deck, have some fun with it. Like, if you don't think that you can play a valuable list, if you don't think you have anything that's gonna like really work, then don't go for it. But like, yeah, overall, it's gonna be pretty solid to set up. Obviously, the cycles are going to be the strongest cards here. They're designed to be the set sellers, and that means that they often have a lot of power points sort of assigned to them. So the listeners and the hybrid cycle of 10, all really strong, as well as the sites. All of the legendaries in this setup are pretty decent, but the sites probably come after the hybrid cards in terms of overall power level. So that's it for the legendaries. We'll break down the rares, commons, and uncommons, talk a bit more about how they play in draft and what kind of setups we're going with there. I hope this was a more helpful view. People have been asking me about legendary crafting guides a lot. I think that in general you should craft whatever makes you happy, and like usually I don't like to disenchant anything because I always find something dumb to do with something, and like there's always, if you're playing for fun, then really any legendary will do to do something interesting and try a fun deck style. You can always build around legendaries. They are always build around cards, and they are usually not the primary source of power in the set. So to get into that, we're definitely going to be talking about uncommons, rares, and commons in the future. So tune in for that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow, Thursday? This will come up on Wednesday, so it'll be Thursday. We'll be streaming about 3 PST. Cheers, everyone. Bye.